give it about another minute. All right, we still got folks headed in here, but want to go ahead and get started. All righty. All right, everybody, good afternoon and welcome to our 9th session in the Conversations in Transportation series with Nixite. Again, I'm Andy Wagner. I help Dr. Hummer put these sessions on. We're really looking forward to a great session today with Ed McKinney from Charlotte DOT. I'll let Dr. Hummer introduce him in a moment, but a couple of announcements as always. If you've been to one of these before, they're pretty much the same announcements. Two things really. If you're going to be claiming a PDH credit for this session, you will receive a link to those forms after the session. You'll get that this afternoon. If you signed up after I close registration, if you send me an email, I will try and remember to add you to that list, but you may need to email me again. Just make sure you get those forms. Second is, in order to facilitate the Q&A portion of the session, that'll be kind of the last quarter of the hour. We remind you to enter your questions in using the Q&A function here in Zoom. If you put it in the chat, we may catch it, but if you put it in the Q&A function, we'll all be able to see it. All the panelists will be able to see it, and we'll have those questions near the end of the hour. Again, you can submit those at any time. You don't need to wait, but use the Q&A function to submit any questions. I think that's all that I had, and I will send it over to Dr. Hummer.
Thanks, Andy, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joe Hummer, Mobility and Safety Division of NCDOT and the past president of Nixite. Pleased to be with you for our 9th Conversation in Transportation. The purpose of this series is to educate our members through conversation with transportation industry leaders. We're trying to line up interesting people with interesting topics and ideas, and hope to appeal to our transportation professionals of all ages, from retirees to students. So thank you for joining us for that. And more thanks to the sponsors. That's the Strategic Initiative Council and the Young Members Council, and of course our Nixite sponsors too. You saw some of the logos on the welcome screen there. So our topic today is transportation in Charlotte, largest city in North Carolina, growing fast. Our guest is Ed McKinney. Ed is the Deputy Director of the Charlotte DOT, leading the development of Charlotte's Strategic Mobility Plan and critical transportation aspects of the city's new Unified Development Ordinance. Ed's career includes over 2 decades of private and public service in transportation, urban design, and community planning. He brings a collaborative, multidisciplinary, and community-based perspective to urban transportation planning and design, shaped by a background in architecture and city planning. Over the course of his career, he's directed a wide range of efforts, including transit planning, corridor and urban redevelopment, and large-scale private land development strategies. Ed's been with the city since 2013. Ed, thank you so much for joining us.
No, great to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Very good, good. The problem we really want to focus on today is congestion, with the sort of setup that Charlotte is growing fast, and if it continues to grow, the question is, will congestion really reach some kind of tipping point? Will the congestion spread geographically around to more and more streets and highways and into more hours of the day? Is Charlotte sort of doomed to become another Atlanta or Houston or LA with congestion on many roads and many hours each day? You know, if you go to LA, there's 11 p.m. there's still congestion on the freeways. Is that the way Charlotte is headed? And I think we can agree that that really impedes the quality of life in those cities. So that's what we're really trying to focus on today. And then on the positive side, what can we do to prevent this? So that's where we're headed. Let's set the stage with a few facts, and correct me if I misstate any of these, but Charlotte is the largest city in North Carolina with a population of about 900,000, 16th or so in the US, big city. Metro area about 2.7 million, 23rd in the US, so big metro area. Population growing in recent years about 1.3% per year, making it one of the fastest growing large cities in the US. But with a density of about 3,000 people per square mile, Charlotte is one of the least dense big cities in the US. And then the final one I want to throw at everybody is Charlotte drivers seem to lose about 17 hours per year in congestion. It's about 4 minutes per working day. And that is about 50th or so in the US, at this point, one of the least congested large cities in the US. All that sound about right to you?
It does, yeah. That's a great, accurate picture of where we are, for sure.
So then the better question, what can we do about it, right? So let's start on land use. Is the city interested in continuing to attract people and jobs?
Absolutely. I mean, going back to some of the stats you just described. I mean, we, as you know, we're one of the fastest growing cities in the country, and there's a pretty well established commitment that Charlotte has to economic development and growth. For us and from my perspective, cities have to continue to grow. I mean, there's a successful, vibrant city has no choice but to grow, and so. Charlotte, again, is certainly very committed to that growth. As you described, there's a tremendous amount of challenge that comes with that, but there's no way to not be a vibrant, growing city without having those challenges. And, the benefits of that are, you've got employment opportunities, the educational opportunities that come with that. So, I mean, to be a successful city, to support, upward mobility, you have to grow and certainly just face the challenges of that growth. Back to your initial premise around congestion, what you just described feels very much like what I hear every Monday night or every third Monday night when we're doing rezoning cases with city council, and almost every major rezoning, the basic question is traffic, transportation, and congestion. Just to kind of poke the conversation today, I'll kind of exaggerate something, and I would never say it this way in front of council, and hopefully this is a safe audience.
We're among friends here. Yep.
But what I would say is, to kind of steal a phrase from the 80s, congestion is good. It's a sign of growth. It's a sign of being a successful place. Congestion in a place like Charlotte is inevitable. And really for us, it's how do you manage that congestion? How do you deal with what that growth means? Back to the idea of congestion is good. That there's a healthy tension there where that level of congestion supports things like transit. It supports things like better land use planning. It changes behavior, and so it's a delicate balance. You're right. We don't want to be Los Angeles, but we can't. It's hard to explain this, particularly to neighborhoods that are frustrated by development and what's happening around their neighborhoods. But again, we can't. We have to face it. It's a management thing for us, and as you kind of alluded to, we can talk more. It's it's not just about transportation investment. It's really about land use and the right kind of, vision for growth.
Yeah, good. I'm a native of Detroit. That is the classic non-growing city, and between that and growth, I'd take growth for sure too. So good points. Are there where's the growth going to occur? Are there more empty spaces that the city can annex and develop in a sort of way that they have over the last 100 years or so, or will the future growth mean more density?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's obviously a little bit of both. And one of the challenges we have in Charlotte is the spread of our geography, like you described. We are one of the least dense cities, and we span a geography of a little over 300 square miles. And so, that what's interesting and challenging about that is you can imagine we've got everything on the spectrum from ex-urban, undeveloped, rural land, all the way to uptown, our most intensive urban center. And so you got everything in between, and trying to find the right mobility strategy for that diversity is pretty challenging. But to your question, I mean, there is a tremendous potential for growth. I mean, if you compare, it's an interesting comparison. As you mentioned, we're one of the least dense cities. If you take the most dense city in our country, New York, compare ourselves to that, they have about the same square miles, right? So, and they're at a density of around 30,000, 10 times, around 30,000 people per square mile. And the reason I would bring that comparison is not that we want to be in New York, but what that tells you is we have a tremendous amount of growth capacity, right? And even if we never expanded our boundaries and annexed any more land, I would argue, again, we've got the physical capacity to continue to grow within that boundary and be a successful place. You've got to do it with a very strong land use plan and some disciplined decisions about where we put growth. Maybe we could talk more about the transit things we're doing, et cetera. But again, one of the challenges we have in the community conversations is people feel as if we're built out and we can't absorb another apartment project or another development. And the fact of the matter is we're not even close, right? We're a city that has just a tremendous capacity for future growth.
Does increasing density necessarily mean higher housing prices? That's we talk about New York, San Francisco, the denser cities in the U.S. That's the first thing that comes to my mind anyways. Density equals expensive. Is that necessary?
Again, yes and no. And just like congestion, every city that's vibrant and growing will always have a housing affordability challenge. And so again, those are things that naturally come with growth. And you've got to, our city's approach to that is pretty multi-pronged, right? We do some very specific financial support of affordable housing. We try to do everything we can from a land use standpoint to support, growth of affordable housing. You're right, as we get more dense and some of the places that are attractive to be dense, like around our transit stations, have a challenge of being of lacking affordability, just given the nature of how that market works. But again, one of the things we are trying to do, and some more recently, some other cities have kind of led the way, is trying to open up the entitlement of our city to increase housing opportunities overall. So if we have a supply demand problem, one of our challenges is we make denser housing development hard to do, right? There's the typical NIMBY, there's the typical zoning obstacles, there's a whole, as many of us would know, there's a whole historic kind of racism that goes to how we've set up our zoning policies. And so, our recently adopted comprehensive plan opens that up and says we want to, eliminate single family zoning isn't exactly what we're doing, but what we're doing is opening up the ability for single family zoning areas to be, to have middle income housing, to have other, multifamily opportunities. And so for what I would say, the notion of housing challenge in a city like Charlotte is we've got to be doing many things, but one of those is just opening up more opportunities just to increase the supply. And generally that will have a beneficial, long-term beneficial impact on housing affordability.
Good. Learn some lessons from some of those expensive places out there. Is Charlotte encouraging infill housing and duplexes and granny flats and some of the ways that to just get more units in the existing ground?
Yes, for sure. I mean, we had historically, going back probably 10 years, we were on a leading edge on the accessory dwelling unit granny flats. We had opened up our ordinance to pretty liberally allow that to happen in our single family areas. It hasn't really provided the benefit we thought. And so one of the things we're in the middle of, I think you mentioned that we're in the middle of finalizing our unified development ordinance. We hope to have that adopted by council later this summer. And, so through that ordinance, we've taken even some bigger steps to making, like, as I mentioned, making many of our residential zoning districts have a pretty broad flexibility for duplexes, triplexes, the accessory units. And so we're trying. I mean, there's still a question, there's some testing there about where the market is and what sometimes just getting zoning out of the way isn't the only thing that's in the way. And so, there's still some experimenting with that, but we are pretty committed. This going all the way back to our comp plan. That was a major kind of equity goal. And so we're trying to actually implement that in our ordinance as we get into the details.
And when interest rates shoot up like they have, I mean, who knows? But we're talking about really the longer term here. So hopefully those things settle out. Sounds good. Where do the employers want to be these days? Is there a demand when companies are interested in Charlotte? Do they want to be uptown or do they want to be out along the 485 or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And my observation, I would say over the last 10 years here in Charlotte is there is a shift. And I'm almost thinking it's becoming to be a tipping point where the headquarters that we've recently attracted and some of the major office development that's going on are in uptown and are along our transit stations. And so, Lowe's moved, or I shouldn't say moved, but committed to a major concentration of office in South End, immediately adjacent to our Blue Line transit station. We've seen, like, again, over the last 5 years, the South End area, again, around our Blue Line transit just south of uptown, has dramatically increased in office development. There was almost no office there 5-10 years ago. Now we've got 4 or 5 projects already built and probably 4 or 5 underway. And so all that to say is I think it's clear the leading edge kind of 21st century employers are recognizing that to attract talent, they need to be in cities like Charlotte that have a relatively low cost of living and a great lifestyle, but they know that their employees want to be in places that are walkable, that are accessible by transit, that have amenities that come with urban places. And so the notion of the sort of suburban office parks hasn't gone away, but I think what we're seeing certainly in Charlotte is there's a significant new focus on urban places with multimodal access.
And on the other hand, the industrial warehouse truck-oriented businesses are certainly, I think they're booming lately, but they want to be out along the 485 in the suburban areas, right?
Correct, and you're right. It's interesting, as we would all know, the shift of online retailing and the pandemic has probably even accelerated that. I mean, we are seeing a lot of industrial development, a lot of industrial rezonings, and there's a lot of market pressure for industrial, just really essentially it's distribution. And so you're right. I mean, they want and need to be in places that are more, auto oriented, but really truck and access oriented. So, we're seeing those kind of on the edge for us around 485, access to the interstate system. We've got the multimodal or transit freight multimodal transfer station out in near the airport. And so there's a gravity to some of that that's happening for, certainly on the suburban edges of Charlotte.
Yeah, good. So talk about parking a little bit here. I was telling you, went to the South End for the first time in years and years for the mid-year meeting a couple of weeks ago. That was great. We parked for free on the street, on the curb, 3 blocks away from the light rail station, and the meeting was adjacent to that. And then while we're riding the Blue Line, we noticed, lots of parking garages, lots of parking lots. In other words, parking looks pretty cheap and easy in Charlotte still to this point, even around the station. So are you guys changing parking regulations for newer developers, or even for existing locations? And what do you think's going to happen in the future regarding parking?
No, that's another great observation about where we are, and you're absolutely right. I think we do have probably a more suburban attitude about parking that hasn't caught up with our urban investment we've made in transit. And so a couple things we are doing. So as mentioned, back to the Unified Development Ordinance, we're revamping everything. We've created a set of new transit-oriented zoning districts and have tried to liberalize how we deal with parking in those districts. So where we've gotten to where we're not in some of those most intense districts, we're not at all requiring parking. There's a few even in those districts where we put limits on how much parking, with the notion that we don't want development to provide too much parking, because as you're implying, the notion of having the wrong balance of kind of free and easy parking is really counter to what we're trying to do from a mode shift and a transit supportive situation. And so you're right, that's probably one of our bigger challenges, is we haven't fully changed our parking attitude around the investment we've made in transit. And we're another little detail, we're in the middle of revamping even how we manage on-street parking, and so we're going to sort of relook at that this year and try to modernize that approach with to your point, as to where we want to price and manage that parking in a way that supports turnover for businesses, but also helps focus and push to where we want people to be using transit, particularly in like South End and Uptown.
You're probably aware the city of Raleigh, if I understand right, recently got rid of its parking minimum on new development. So we expect some movement that way for Charlotte too.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I mean that's we're very aware of that. In fact, again, we've been in lots of council conversations around the Unified Development Ordinance, and parking was probably, of the 2 or 3 hot issues with council on the UDO, parking was probably the 1 or 2 top ones. I think trees were the other one, but parking was right next to it. And the conversation about, hey, Raleigh's getting rid of all parking. And so there was a healthy debate with council about that. For us politically, we had council members kind of on both ends of that. And so where we landed was sort of what I said, is we've tried to calibrate some districts that are going in that direction, but had to balance, some pretty reasonable concerns that neighborhoods adjacent to some of these centers, they were, whether it's real or not, they're certainly concerned about the parking that would spill in and impact their neighborhoods. And so we weren't quite ready to be as aggressive as Raleigh, but I would agree from my perspective, that's where we should be. We should let the market decide that. And just some things we just, from a regulatory standpoint, we should just not be in the way of. We just need to let the market dictate.
That's kind of awesome to hear from somebody so involved in zoning as you are.
Yeah, I spent like you said, I've been here for 10 years. I spent probably the first 4 or 5 in the planning department.
Good. So you mentioned the Unified Development Ordinance a couple of times. There's other transportation plan efforts underway in the city right now. Can you briefly describe for us what the other big plans are?
Sure. Yeah. So the kind of framework for us, and we just literally got this adopted this week with councils. We put together our strategic mobility plan, which was we did that really to follow on and help implement the comprehensive plan that got adopted last year. And so we've been in the works of that for the last year. And what we tried to do in this plan is really put together all the various plans from a transportation standpoint together and make sure that they're all working in the same way. So, transit is a big part of that. So we have our transit CATS, our transit agency, has long range plans around extending and new rail corridors in addition to the Blue Line. They have some very interesting new ideas around bus priority and really strengthening our bus system, adding frequency, doing some things in concert with us around signal prioritization and things we could do around, queue jumping to help efficiency of routes. We're working hand in hand with the county on their Greenway master plan. And so the kind of multimodal bike network that we envision, we've worked hand in hand to really make those two systems help us support each other. And so what we've tried to do now is recognize that we got lots of partners from a mobility standpoint. Certainly NCDOT in the state is one of those. CATS is one of those. The county with their Greenway system is one of those. So we've tried in a new way and really recognize that the CDOT isn't the one agency that manages and controls mobility in a city like Charlotte. We really have lots of partners, and our job is to make sure that we're all working in concert.
Good. I think it was the strategic plan, the sort of headline item there, the one that caught my eye anyway, was and I'm going to quote it here, I'm sure you're very familiar. As a community, half of our commute trips will be made by means other than a single occupancy vehicle through walking, biking, or taking transit. And I believe that was the aspiration for 2040. So first of all, just clarification, does that mean all commuters to all jobs within the city?
Yeah, so it's an ambitious aspiration, but yeah, essentially, in some other cities have been going this way with their plans. It's really this kind of notion of a 50-50 mode split, right? And so, as you would know, and many on this meeting would know, if you could make that shift, just think about the capacity that opens up. And so that is there is some skepticism about that, but that is our aspiration. I get asked a lot, and we're asked a lot as we were developing this plan, like, is that realistic? Part of the answer I would say to this group is whether we get there or not is not necessarily as important as the notion that that's where we're trying to go. And so it helps us with council and the community prioritize where we should be investing and help us be accountable to putting our dollars in our policies like parking and others, employ those things to get to to aspire to that goal. Again, there's cities that are there, even American cities. While we're not Seattle, for example, or Washington, DC, but Seattle, I think their mode split they've got about 44%. DC is around 34%. Again, those are completely different cities with a completely different kind of transit infrastructure. But the point there is, it is, if we wanted to, we could build the city that does that.
Have y'all modeled that in a model that the city maintains, or a regional model, or what? I'm really honestly having trouble imagining what that 50-50 city would look like, what that looks like on the ground. So, have you put pen to paper there?
A little bit. Yeah, I think we haven't done, what you're implying, which is we haven't designed our regional model to kind of test what that looks like. But what we did do is say, somewhat how we got to the 50-50 was we did look at it in this case, we used the model, we looked at it 2045 and said, we did a little math to say that if we wanted to maintain, back to congestion, if we want to maintain the level of congestion we have today, we kind of use vehicle miles traveled as kind of the way to do that. and we jumped to 2045, what would we have to do to keep that level, consistent? And so again, whether we can get there, it essentially told us like, okay, if you could get down to a 50-50 mode split, in theory, you could maintain the level of vehicular kind of congestion we have today. And to me, that's the headline for us is, okay, so, okay, community and council, if one of the things we want to do is manage congestion, that demonstrates that investment in other things like transit, et cetera, has a direct relationship to managing congestion.
Yep. That makes sense. I was still I guess put me in the skeptical crowd there a little bit, though. That means every bit of growth in the next 20 or so years, those new people would be on the bus or train or walking or bicycling.
Yeah, and again, with a little bit of math, it doesn't mean there aren't growth in vehicular trips. There's still a amount of growth that happens in vehicular trips when we do the math. And you're right. I mean, back to the notion of how diverse we are, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone that lives in the suburban areas is going to move in the same way that people who live in some of our activity centers or urban areas. So there's certainly a diversity there, but what that implies is, right, we've got to really build intense mixed use places to put as many people in those places to take advantage. So that means if you're living in Uptown, maybe 20% of your trips are using a car. So it does mean a real strong commitment to land use and making sure that we've got places that can actually demonstrate this shift.
And that people still have access to opportunity. I think you're implying that with the mixed use phrase there, that if I'm choosing to live uptown or next to a light rail and give up my car, that within a reasonable travel distance, 20 minutes or whatever, that I can still get to a whole bunch of employers, my kids can get to schools, doctors, all the things that I need to maintain my lifestyle, right? So
absolutely,
that kind of mixed use is really essential in that vision, right?
Right, and and another thing to consider, and this was embedded in our thinking too, and I think we've learned a lot through the pandemic. And while we don't know where we're going to end up, I think it's pretty clear that the way we work is different. And so, as we all know, I know this is an extreme, but 2 years ago there was nobody on our roads, and we all of a sudden gained a tremendous amount of capacity because everybody was working at home. Not that that's everybody's going to work from home moving forward, but it's pretty clear from where we are today in Charlotte that a lot of people still are working from home. Even at the city, we've allowed a hybrid work style where our employees, come in 2 to 3 days a week and have an amount of flexibility. And just that shift in behavior is part of our mode strategy, and is clearly a way in which I think as cities can be managing, our congestion and our infrastructure moving forward.
And that implies that the city would encourage employers to allow their employees to have a hybrid schedule or work at home.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting. Obviously, as we all know, some employers take totally different perspectives. We're a heavy banking city, obviously, and I think our banks are still a little on the conservative side and bringing folks back. But there's still a hybrid there, and we've seen levels of traffic kind of come back. But what we have noticed is that the peaks are different, right? Like people are coming in at different times, or if a few percentage of folks are only coming in 2 or 3 times a week, that does have a capacity benefit to us, particularly in the peak hour.
Good. I want to remind our participants to type in a question into the Q&A area if you've got one. We appreciate that. We'll make time toward the end of the hour to address some of the questions that come in. And so don't hesitate to do that if you've got one. We got a couple of good ones in there. We'll get to those in a few minutes. Ed, want to turn to discuss light rail for a few minutes here, because it's certainly a big part of current Charlotte and what I'm hearing the Charlotte plans going forward. So the Blue Line's been open for 10 or 12 years going south from uptown, and then the Blue Line extension north toward the university for 4 years or so. How did the Blue Line ridership do during the pandemic? Has it recovered yet?
Yeah, not so good. And it hasn't quite recovered yet. So yeah, I mean, and then we're not different than any other major city. All of them face the same challenge, and the same problem with our bus network. So ridership is significantly down and hasn't shown strong signs of recovering even as we've been moving out of the pandemic. And I think every agency across the country is still trying to figure out why and what's, there's some behavior there that I think many of the transit agencies are still trying to put their finger on. But I don't think we have a choice but to continue to invest and believe in the transit system as part of our mobility strategy. I think we're obviously learning a lot, and may have to shift and do some new things. But I think transit, regardless of the pandemic, I think transit is still a really important part of our future.
Any talk of fare-free transit out into the future, Charlotte?
There had been, and still is out there. I think CATS hasn't fully embraced that. Partly, I don't think they're opposed to it, but there is a financial cost to that. Like, there is a certain amount of fare revenue that is important to their bottom line, and so if as a community we want to commit to that, that would have some pretty important valuable equity ramifications. But it would mean we've got to find the dollars somewhere to support that. And but so the conversation has come up several times here in Charlotte. We just haven't quite gone there yet.
Yeah, again, that's a Raleigh thing that Raleigh bus system just announced the other day. They extended it for another year.
Oh, okay.
So,
Good.
The Blue Line has sparked a tremendous amount of development. Like I said, being there for the mid-year meeting, we all noticed that it's just awesome. Looks like especially multifamily housing units, and it goes to the south end and then north of uptown toward the NODA area. I describe it as awesome. Do you have a number for us, or put a better scale to how much development has occurred?
Yeah, I should have looked it up. I haven't looked at the actual numbers of units and things recently. I think we're at a point now where it's probably well north of $5 or $6 billion worth of private investment on that, on the system. And as a bottom line, I don't know what it is in today's dollars, but we spent $1.5 million or $1.5 billion or so on the system completely, and to have that kind of private investment, I think proves out the value of that infrastructure. No, and you're right. I mean, just the Blue Line extension to the north has only been open for just under 10 years now. And so, the original Blue Line opened back in 2007. And so even to the north now, we're seeing some accelerated development around those stations, primarily multifamily. But like I said earlier, what has been a really interesting change in the south end, where for the first period of time, it was really just multifamily development. And you might argue even not as intense enough. I mean, it was really still the kind of typical structured parking, but 4 or 5 story kind of stick built multifamily. But the new amount of office really has been dramatic, and that's really what needs to happen. Like, for the strategy to be successful, it's not just about housing. It's got to be where we're starting to concentrate employment. We're seeing a lot of new retail service and destination kind of retail in South End, and so getting that mix is really how you make the system really take full advantage of the value of that infrastructure.
Yeah, if you really have aspirations for families to give up cars. That mix seems to me to be so critical.
Right.
Another aspect I noticed at the mid-year meeting was the shared use path. I believe you call it the rail trail that runs along for I think miles and miles along the blue line, and it seems to me that it helps make better use of what otherwise would be dead space between stations, right? That you know, in a usual transit model, we got a station, we got a clump of high rises over the station, and then pretty worthless real estate in between the stations along the line where all they get is the noise, but none of the benefit. The rail trail seems to really mitigate that. Am I seeing it right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's a pretty unique asset for us. And as you described, I mean, it is essentially a parallel corridor to the light rail system. And so you have this access along the whole corridor. It activates that whole edge. We've got now development that's literally fronting, not just at the stations, but along the whole corridor. I mean, if you walk down certain parts of it, you're literally walking past, the balconies and outdoor patios of multifamily housing fronting directly on the trail, fronting directly on the rail. And so it's a unique condition. It's unique because in South End, that was an existing rail line that was repurposed for transit, and the right of way there was, in excess of what we needed for the light rail. So CAPS was able to, put the trail in as part of it. And so it was sort of a unique circumstance of that situation. But what we've then done is recognize how, like you said, how valuable it is. And that's been that idea now is in every new, transit investment we want to make. And so we're in the middle of planning for the Silver Line, which is sort of the east-west version of the Blue Line for us. And one of the things we're doing in that planning and in preliminary engineering is looking for and defining a rail trail that would go with that one. Different because certainly we don't have the right of way like we did in South End, but we recognize that it's a good part of how we should plan for the system and use that idea to really think about how we do that on other corridors.
Yeah, even the north end of the Blue Line where the light rail runs in the median of Tryon just seemed to me to have a different atmosphere. Wasn't terrible, but it just wasn't the same. You got so many lanes of street between the rail and the path, and then the front of the buildings. It's tough to recreate that atmosphere that's in the South End.
Yeah, I mean, again, South End is so unique because that rail, it was an industrial area, and so that rail line served the industrial area. So as you can imagine, then all of that land, the pattern of that land use was connected to the rail line. And so you weren't, like you mentioned up on the north side, we were sort of inserting rail in the middle of a road. What we were doing now is just taking an existing rail and just inserting light rail into it. So then as that industrial development developed along it, they could do everything we just described. They could front on it. So you're right. What happens then is you're sort of in the middle of the block. You've got a transit station and then you got development all around it. And the roads are really on the edges of that development pattern. And so, yeah, it creates a tremendously valuable and walkable context. It's really hard to replicate everywhere else. And it is a challenge on the north side with the Blue Line because you're in the middle of a state, highway and it's got to still serve the vehicular function. So it's not exactly the same, but I think we had a good partnership with NCDOT and did as good as we could have done to make all of that work.
Sure. Mentioned the Silver Line, 29 miles, if I have it correct, from Gaston County all the way arcing through uptown and then down to Union County, past Matthews into Union County. The cost estimate I heard was $12 billion. Is that the right number?
Yeah, it sounds about right. It might be a little less than that, but 12 to 13 billion was sort of that whole. We had a whole system of investment, just including transit. But yeah, you're probably by the time we actually get it, designed and find the dollars, it'll probably be at least 12 billion.
So the obvious follow-up then is, where do you find $12 billion laying around? It's hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, so if you have followed, we've been in a conversation around this notion of what we call here a transformational mobility network, which was this idea of the full build out of CATS's 2030 plan, which includes Silver Line, also includes commuter rail up to the northern towns, the completion of our streetcar, et cetera. So there's other things that part of that. But it also included a series of, bike greenway investment, sidewalk investment, roadway investment. So we put a package that was kind of multimodal. We did, there's some math that's gone around it and some movement that's happening politically. And if the current math is if you did a 1 cent sales tax in Mecklenburg County, that would, through all sorts of other things with bonds, et cetera, gives it we could actually achieve and pay for that amount of investment. Seems hard to achieve, but again, we're one of the fastest growing cities in the country. We've got a pretty strong tax base, and whether we can get that politically supported and referendum voted, but the math of that, would allow us to get there. Still with some assumptions around federal support and maybe not state support, but and again, other cities, Austin, there is no other option, right? If we need to make that investment, whether it's sales tax or a combination of sales and property tax, those are just the only ways you're ever going to find the way to, make that kind of investment.
Good. We do have some questions that have come in. Appreciate those. And again, if you've got others, please enter them into the Q&A area of the program there. So Scott asks, please speak to how existing right-of-way can be repurposed for non-automotive uses. For example, removing curbside parking to create wider plazas for restaurant, public seating, et cetera.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And we're actually doing a few of those things and testing a number of those things. So couple of examples. We've just recently completed a couple of phases of what we call our Uptown Cycle Link, which is really a two-way cycle, dedicated cycle track for bicycles sort of through our Uptown area. There's two greenways kind of on either side of Uptown. And so what this cycle link does is connect those two greenways. And so that's exactly what we did is we took a lane out of one of the roads that goes through Uptown and repurposed it. There's some of it was on-street parking, some of it was travel lane, and we did the analysis and kind of made the trade-off decision about trading some amount of vehicular capacity to provide for this other multimodal infrastructure. So we've done that. We've also experimented a little bit with the bus, kind of a bus-only strategy. We took 3 or 4 blocks in Uptown that connects directly to our transit center and took a lane. It's a 3 or 4 block stretch that has they sort of combined several routes that come into Uptown and go to our transit center. So there was a lot of operational value by dedicating a lane for that. So we did that about 2-3 years ago. We tested that farther out on one of our corridors with the notion of this bus priority strategy. So we tested it was possible. We got a lot of interesting pushback from the neighborhoods and others around that were still a little auto-centric. So we've still got some community challenges with that, but it's all possible. And to the broader point of the question is, if we're going to switch to this other kind of this 50-50 mode split or something in that direction, we don't have more right away, and we're going to have to just make different decisions about the infrastructure we have. So that transforming some of our existing infrastructure and trading it off is going to be one of the things we're going to have to do to kind of get to where we want to
go. Good. Thanks. Don asks, in any community, there's some popular businesses that do not have adequate parking for their customers. So how do you plan to address that as complaints roll in if we're changing how we do parking?
Yeah, another good question. So part of it is how we, and again, I mentioned it, we're sort of expanding and modernizing how we manage the curb space for on-street parking. So there's a lot of these commercial districts where we still have probably a kind of a 1980s attitude about how we manage on-street parking. And so we're going to be expanding, how we meter and provide for on-street parking. So, there's a great supply of public right of way with on-street parking that it can be useful for particularly those kind of commercial districts that are adjacent and tightly related to neighborhoods. And the notion that in these places, you just have to know that in some of them, like South End, transit is really what we want you to be using. There's the notion that we're going to have to kind of think about how we manage residential parking permits to make sure it doesn't bleed into the neighborhoods. But it's, parking will, again, be one of those things that we'll be constantly kind of challenged to deal with. But the notion is you can't have great places without parking problems, I would argue. If you want a good walkable place that's got the character and vibrancy we want, you just can't, parking the car can't be your first priority. You've got to create a place that's people first and solve for parking after.
Yep. Nobody worries about parking in Manhattan or Venice or so. Yeah, the great urban places. Thanks, Paul. Asked pretty much the top technical question. I think here you mentioned that congestion is not always a negative thing. It could be a sign of a successful and vibrant place. But in the engineering profession, many of our performance metrics, goals, and objectives are focused solely around measures of congestion and vehicle delay. So what goals and metrics should we engineers be pursuing, and what are the problems we're trying to solve as we head that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I agree that, and I would be obviously a proponent of this just because from my perspective, I actually, as I mentioned before, I don't come to it from a traffic engineering standpoint. I really come to it from a kind of a city planning perspective. And so I'm sure the audience knows, I mean, there's lots of shifts that we need to be making about how we measure, because it's always been said, like, you value what you measure. And so if we're only going to measure, the incremental second by second delay at an intersection, and we're going to make all of our urban city decisions around, the 3 or 4 seconds of added delay at an intersection, we're never going to build a city that's that does all the things we need to do to support, employment growth, et cetera. And so I think we do need to shift. I mean, there's lots of ways to do that. California is, moving to a vehicle mile travel kind of measure that's, provides a broader perspective than just intersection by intersection. We've actually, one of the things we're doing with the UDO is we're completely revamping our traffic impact study guidelines for private development. And while we still have a component that is the basic traffic analysis that does look at, number of trips and their impact on intersections and all the analysis that goes with that, we've really put in front of that and prioritized and defined a system that's really around moving people and travel demand management. So we start first with those things. And so we calibrate, based on the scale of your project. We've now anticipated sort of tiers of investment that we want you to make in our pedestrian infrastructure and pedestrian access in the places like our TOD areas. Depending upon the scale of it, you're going to trigger TDM expectations. And so we're shifting away from, our most urban places. I don't even want to do a traffic study anymore. I want development like in TOD areas to help us build pedestrian infrastructure and to commit to doing things around transportation demand management that gets people off the roads. And so, for us, we're trying to flip, what our priorities are, particularly in our most urban places.
Good, thanks. And Andrew comes in with a later question here. What have you learned from the reaction of the Blue Line being open and ingrained in local infrastructure that you will use when planning the future light rail routes?
That's a great question. I mean, I think a couple things we've learned. I think it's proven. It's sort of test of concept. I think we've proven in Charlotte, and now there's no skepticism around that it attracts the right kind of development, that it supports the kind of multimodal access. So I don't think the debate anymore is around what is the value of light rail. I think people see it. On the other end of it, though, I think we have learned that we can't just allow development to happen without any thought. And so one example of that is affordable, we talked about it before, affordable housing. We probably didn't have as strong of expectations that we should have on development that's happened along the Blue Line to support affordable housing. And so in the UDO, we've created some expectations and some both expectations and bonus incentives for development in the transit stations to support affordable housing. The planning of Silver Line is actually looking in advance of actual sites around the stations, and should the city be proactively controlling those for affordability. So again, we found that it's been greatly successful, but we probably lost a few opportunities to really advance other important goals for us, particularly around things like affordable housing.
I think I got time to lob in one more. It's always my favorite. Many of the folks on the call know I've dabbled in automated vehicles a good bit. So I think they're coming to a rich tech savvy area like Charlotte by 2040 or 2045. So, and we got just a couple minutes. So how do you see automated vehicles fitting in with the long-term vision?
Yeah, I mean, as you would know, I mean, I don't think any of us have a full picture of what it's going to mean, but I think we all know that, at least for us from a city perspective, what it's forcing us to do is recognize that we're really sort of a service provider. We have a piece of infrastructure, which is the right of way, not necessarily the physical road. It's the right of way. And so we need to be thinking more creatively about how we afford and provide access for all sorts of service providers, some of which may shift to automated, autonomous vehicles. We've, like many cities, we've had the challenge of dealing with the scooters and service providers. So we've been testing and piloting how we manage and control that. We've got a company out of Toronto that's called Tiny Mile that is doing these little autonomous service delivery. It's like a small little robot that runs on the streets, and the testing they're doing was actually delivering coffee. And so to me, it's going to be the next round of this is just a lot of experimentation. And for us, for a city, it's really now viewing our right of way as really a piece of infrastructure. And there's going to be lots of service providers that are going to want to do some unique things, and we're just going to have to be flexible.
Good. Ed, anything that we got 1 minute left? Anything that I should have asked that you wanted to get out there before we close?
The only thing I would add, I saw it in some of your earlier notes, just really about the profession. And you had an interesting thought around just, what should we be doing as a profession? How do we support young professionals? I mean, just a quick thing I would say is, as you saw, I come from a totally different background from transportation. I learned it through the profession, and I would encourage all of us, particularly on the transportation side, to be thinking of our careers in a pretty broad way. We're really all about building cities and places. And so we can all learn from, developers, from city planners, from social, experts about how cities grow. I would encourage us all to just be always exploring and sort of expanding our perspective on how cities work, because then it'll allow us to think differently about what we do every day around transportation. So,
very good. Ed, as you know, I had like 3 more hours worth of questions, so the hour always goes too quickly. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Very good. And Andy, going to turn it back to you.
All righty. All right. Once again, as a reminder, you'll get the link to the PDH form and evaluation forms in your email later today. If you don't get that by the end of today, please send me an email. Again, my email can be found on the Nixie website. Again, thanks everybody for attending. We're going to have another one of these in August. Date and guest haven't been determined yet, but we will send out an announcement once we get that figured out.
Very good. Thank you all.
All right, thanks everybody.